Muito obrigado. Gracias a todos, Sergio, por la organización. Son una reflexión muy breve. Todos decimos breve y resulta que no es tan breve, pero breve, una reflexión sí, por el codo, ¿no? Sobre las discusiones hasta ahora y como el desafío de cómo reflexionar sobre el largo plazo o largo arco de la convergencia y el crecimiento de los últimos 70 años, 7 décadas, digamos, llamados liberales, y cómo entender entonces nuestra coyuntura actual y una tensión posible entre una palabra que se usó un par de veces esta mañana, el agotamiento de modelos, cómo pensar de agotamientos, si es que en realidad los modelos se agotan. El caso argentino es uno en que nunca se agota. Ese es un poco el problema, porque nunca realmente cae, ¿no? Sobrevive. Y el otro es, y había pedido a Sergio ahora, ¿cómo traducir la palabra growing pains, ¿no?
Dolores del crecimiento.
Claro, sí, dolores del crecimiento. Si estamos en medio de una transición a otro y que no entendemos en esa nublina, estamos frente a la dificultad de entender lo que no existe todavía porque es emergente. Y se suma con eso la nublina en nuestros relatos y narrativas, ¿no? Para colmo, la narrativa del desarrollo, que nació en el siglo XIX, si estamos ya finalmente a fines de un modelo de controlar el tiempo, los tiempos humanos, o si el relato es un conflicto entre poderes, Estados Unidos en declinación, el auge de la China, siempre me hace recordar de un debate muy parecido en los 80 con Japan Inc., que luego se pudo absorber. Y un debate eterno sobre la tecnología, ¿no? Entre las euforias y disforias. Hay que recordar, yo soy historiador, y si uno lee el ensayo sobre la población de Malthus, en cada edición le tocó a Malthus reescribir su narrativa que había empezado como una interpretación muy pesimista. Y sus amigos, entre ellos David Ricardo y otros, insistía que tenía que considerar los cambios tecnológicos de la después llamada primera, bueno, fue llamada The Industrial Revolution, después The First Industrial Revolution, y que en cada versión del ensayo sobre la población iba redactando y cambiando su relato, ¿no? Crear el relato forma parte del mismo proceso y que no entendemos muy bien qué es nuestro proceso. Me toca hablar de Hirschman, su nombre, su espíritu flota. Hay que incorporarlo. Entonces, hablemos directamente de él, a ver si esto funciona así. Voy a pasar al inglés para ser un poco más rápido y seguramente más claro. ¿Está bien? Ok. Okay. Muy bien. So in 1968, you will remember, some of you, a film by the Cuban, a film about the Cuban director, the Cuban novelist Tomás Gutiérrez Aleas. The film that was the filmmaker based on the novel by Edmundo Desnoyes called Memories of Underdevelopment, Subdesarrollo. This is at the time when Fernando Henrique is writing his book with Enzo Falletto, and the protagonist in the film Sergio walks around Havana unable to recognize his own world after the revolution. And the questions of development and underdevelopment are associated with alienation, broken time, lost attachments, including to his own girlfriends. In the course of the movie, efforts to try to talk with his girlfriend and esas conversaciones que no funcionan, que no cierran. This image of estrangement and loss was commonplace among intellectuals in Latin America at the time, associated with a growing sense of pessimism around development. And you can hear this also in the analysis of even Fernando Henriquez at that time. But of course, and we will get eventually to the relationship between Fernando Henrique and Albert Hirschman, but this was not the case for Albert Hirschman. For Hirschman, development did give rise to a sense of commonness and collective purpose. I have a feeling that this may be why Ignacio wants us to talk about Hirschman here. And in fact, one of his favorite aphorisms, y esas una de las razones por la cual tengo que hablar en inglés para captar sus palabras, después tal vez las podemos traducir. One of his favorite aphorisms inverted the idea that we should pursue happiness in favor of the happiness of the pursuit. That there was something about the process of development that yielded surprises, some tragic, some comedic, certainly many of them unintended, but that we should treat the process itself as a source of happiness, not the goal. But that this was strongest when it was most collective. And I'll end on that note in a few minutes. But for the time being, he imagined himself in the 1960s as a counterpoint to the kind of narrative that was very much more familiar to the colleagues whom he loved deeply in Santiago, in Brazil, in Argentina, which he feared was a narrative based on the absence of hope. And this is, of course, what linked him to the word that came up earlier this morning, ligado con el idea del posibilismo, in direct opposition to what he called fracasomania, associated with the idea that the model that had been created in the 1930s and 1940s was exhausted. And we talked about Guillermo O'Donnell, the notion of agotamiento that was so pervasive among Latin American social scientists. So, this is a photograph taken by a wonderful Colombian photographer of Albert in 1962. So I'm often asked, for those of you who don't know, I wrote a book about Albert Hirschman, and I sometimes get asked when I did the book tour thing, which is a very American side of the book business, why should anybody read Albert Hirschman now? Maybe that's a question I'll throw back to us when we're done. But the defense I try to make for reading Hirschman, and sometimes for all old books, including books that are still in paper, the one is that he represented a style of social science, this came up earlier in the conversation, of crossing borders and disciplines. The trespassing notion came out of his idea that social science was a broad family, and that there needed to be conversations and not isolated disciplines. Second, that he led a kind of exemplary life. He was a sort of action intellectuals in the sense that he lived in a world of ideas, but also committed to the notion that ideas belong to the world, and that there was a relationship between action, observation, analysis, and action. And this is one of the reasons why he enjoyed coming to Latin America so much, because the hyper-professionalization of the social sciences in the United States had driven a wedge between the notion of the worldliness of ideas and ideas in the world. So his concepts were always deeply embedded, and we're going to hear one of his great ones by Lourdes shortly. But it also meant that he was very skeptical of the kind of formal theorizing that the invented self-referential coordinates of many North American-style social sciences had created for their own refinement and embellishment. And when he died, and the book came out right around the time that he died, in fact, I sometimes think he planned it this way, behind my back, there were a lot of very nostalgic reviews, or reviews of the book that doubled as obituaries for him that were extremely nostalgic. For there was a sense of generalized loss, not just about him, but for a certain style of social science. He was, as Shayla Ben Habib, the Yale philosopher, said, our last cosmopolitan moralist. And he presented a model for framing puzzles and offering aphorisms, solutions, strategies, these are words we'll talk about, for how to solve them. And finally, I tried to tell people, see if this can move this along. There we are. Many of his insights and ideas continue to have relevance today. The behavioral foundations of a current social science, including behavioral economics, the emphasis on disequilibrium, so in behavioral foundations, exit, voice, and loyalty, in the accent on disequilibrium, which I will come back to at the very end, strategy of economic development, which makes its appearance, if you read Cardoso and Faleto's book, very early on in the book as one of the anchor pieces. The third would be his relationship or the tension between complexity and certainty. In fact, many of the essays that you can read that he wrote are meditations on the method of dealing with complexity instead of searching for certainty. And the fourth and final one, and Pablo's son is involved in a translation, a new translation of a book that was published in English. I can't remember how it was published in Portuguese. In English, it was published as The Rhetoric of Reaction.
A retórica da reação.
Okay. He actually wanted the original title to be a different one, and there's a push to, in the Spanish edition, to have his preferred, which was The Rhetoric of Intransigence.
It's much better for us, for analysis, much better.
Well, we can come back to it, but the point here is that he was trying to explore the frontier between language and democracy and concerned about intransigent rhetorics. All of these lines of thought, though, were the product of a lived experience in the world. It was a very 20th century life of crisis and recovery and reinvention, and a capability of finding hope in some of the most improbable places, and hence the possibilist, which I've been tasked to talk about. So this was a transnational life, a life lived across cultures, across countries, across academic traditions and disciplines. And what was unique about it was not just that lines were crossed, but that here was a figure who did not just go from one space to another, one culture to another, one style of intellectual life to another, abandoning what he left behind in order to absorb what he encountered, but he found ways of combining them, of taking what he brought with him and amalgamating them with the new. He combined and accumulated repertoires. So let's take a brief look at this global life so that we can understand the story behind the invention of the category that he, in a sense, imagines himself as, which was the possibilist. So here's the young man at 9 years old. This is 1924. This is in Berlin. In the full heyday of the Weimar Republic. And I think we have to understand the possibilist's ability to find hope in dark times by going back to Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. One might look back, just as Hannah Arendt did, and look at this as the darkness that had no light to it. And Hirschman resisted this, partly because of his own politics, which got honed at this moment in time in Germany. He was a social democrat. And there is a tension in his politics about his liberalism versus his socialism, maybe something we can talk about. His affection for thinking about markets and whenever people wanted to go for planning solutions, and whenever people wanted to go full throttle into market fundamentalism, he wanted to make a case for socialism. This, by the way, is time out for those of you who have kids. It's very helpful. So time out for socialism. So he was a social democrat, very active, but already at the time that this 9-year-old boy is about to go, and here we begin to see the hallmarks, to a school that was set up in Berlin for Huguenot refugees. So it was a French gymnasium in Berlin that was designed to absorb Protestants fleeing from France. And he was always, and it goes down to creating the Institute for Advanced Study as a haven for fugitives who were having difficulty in Latin America to come and spend time at the Institute for Advanced Study and send their children to Princeton High School. So he was already then combining German and French traditions, multilingual. He became fluent in French and, in fact, would eventually boast, like to show off his French abilities during the German occupation of France. Very brazenly, he was a Jew approaching French policemen and striking up conversations to show off his French ability. He was a Jew. He was an assimilated Jew and believed in the promise of the Enlightenment. So he enjoyed coming to Latin America because of this ideas in the world and the world of ideas. Latin America was also a refuge at a certain point. We'll see in a minute. So it was a source of inspiration, a refuge, and a source of reinvention. He remade himself by coming to Latin America. This was a man, an economist, who had gone through, and we can go through the early life, but he had been pushed out by the McCarthy purges from the United States in 1951 and moved to Colombia, and there would reinvent himself. I'm going to talk about development and possibilism and the possibilist, and I'll tell the story through 5 encounters with perhaps a reflection on, or perhaps we could think about how much the developmentalist narrative, the relato desarrollista, which reached its high water mark in the 1960s, whether or not that's part of the challenge we now have, whether the kind of story we used to tell about how to manage social change and economic progress still has legs. Now, I've said a lot of words for anybody who's seen the book. About Hirschman, it's long, I'm sorry. So let's just try some images. This will be a visual narrative. One little key about the stories of an encounter with development is to think of words that are attached to each one of these encounters, words and their counterpoints. Before we jump in, something to remember that, and I was just reminded the other day in reading something that somebody was writing about Hirschman, saying, well, it was the passions versus the interests, exit, voice, or loyalty. You really have to pay attention to his language. He never said or. He always said and. He was always interested in combinations that yielded new possibilities rather than thinking in diametric ways that you had to choose one or the other. So let's put and in and think about what we get. So the first one is planning and strategies. This is Albert Hirschman in Colombia. This is a swimming pool in a place he liked to go on the weekends outside Bogota. He landed in Colombia, and I like the image, aside from the fact that there are a lot of photographs of Albert Hirschman on his head. In some sense, he was always imagined himself turning Karl Marx on his head. He had arrived in Colombia because he could no longer work in the United States. He was under a suspicion by U.S. Federal authorities, was driven out, went to Colombia on the back of a World Bank, one of the first World Bank reports on a developing country. It was for Colombia, written by, some of you may know who Lachlan Curry was. He was He was a Canadian, though also expelled from the United States during the McCarthy period, who'd come to Colombia, backed by the World Bank, to draft a plan. So plan for the development of a backward country, that was the language at the time, with these missionary planners. They would come down with all of the saber from the north, draft the master plan, and have Colombians act out a narrative that was being presented to them. Hirschman was never particularly found, and he quit after about a year and a half working on the project. He found this idea of what he called the foreign expert syndrome absolutely nauseous, and withdrew and set up his own private consulting company. But there were already some hallmarks to his style. One, for him, doing field work and going out into the campo, for instance, was a source of adventure. And this is a photograph taken in Boyacá, in the highlands outside Bogotá. He loved to drive around Colombia. So the origins of the possibilist, in some sense, has a vehicular origin. He was a terrible driver. I mean, really a bad driver. He was constantly smashing the car, but he loved it. But he really, it got him close to the ground, and this was very important because he picked up one element that he felt that in the way that development was being formalized through the course of the 1950s, that there was an element to the engine of what made development that was lost, which was the role of the private sector. The plan from the World Bank presumed that there was no development. And Hirschman kept trying to explain to his staff and to his colleagues at the central bank, at the Banco de la República in Bogotá, but why not support the people who are already investing, producing, doing things, taking risks? Why do you assume that it's all backward and that there is no market activity, there is no private accumulation? We need to think differently about the development enterprise. And travel and encounters in the field were very important for reminding him. And he kept telling the economists, sorry to beat up on the economists, he always self-identified himself as an economist, but he would go back to the central bank and say, you have to get out of this office building because your vision of the world is a very distorted one. The result was a certain sarcastic attitude to the formal developmental narrative. This was a holiday card done by a very close friend of his, a Hungarian exile who'd moved to Bogotá, who was an early political satirist in Bogotá. It was used as the family holiday card. I mean, I don't want to run out of time here, but the card itself had a story because they would send it off to friends during the holidays with little notes on the back. This is a very American thing to do. And one of the friends who received this card was a colleague that he had met while working on the Marshall Plan in Washington, which is an economist called Thomas Schelling. And Schelling got the card. Oh, and Hirschman had put the card on top of a very short 5-page paper, which is in the Hirschman papers, Hirschman archives. I can't remember the exact title of the little paper, but it was, what's going right in Colombia? Included it into the envelope, sent it to his friend Tom, and said, I thought you might find this very funny. Well, the card and the paper. Because, of course, nothing can go right if you're a World Bank planner. It has to be all wrong, and we have to come up with our magic solutions to the problem. Schelling read it, was captivated, went to the chair of the economics department at Yale, and said, there's this guy in Colombia, who's a very interesting thinker. And didn't we just get some money from the Ford Foundation to fund the first visiting professorship in development economics? Why don't we bring him here for a year to come up as a visiting professor? That restarted Albert Hirschman's professional career. But for the moment in Colombia, you can already pick up his contrarian style and a little bit the role that Fortuna plays in his life. But it was out of his presence at Yale, so the 4 years he lived in Colombia and then at Yale, wound up being a 2-year stay, he would write The Strategy of Economic Development. And if you read the first few pages of Cardoso and Folletto, you'll see how already it had become a key text in the development literature in the 60s. But he chose the title carefully. It was meant to accent the role of strategies and not plans. Or rather, to develop a countervailing pressure against the urge to plan development. He put accent on, I will just mention 4 things. 1, the role of unbalanced growth and disequilibrium, creating particularly pressure points on structures that yielded the necessity to make decisions. That's what he believed was in shortest supply that had to be created in the development process, which was the capacity to make decisions. So number 1 was disequilibrium. Number 2 was the expansion of decision-making capacities. The third is famous, and I don't need to perhaps go on about this, which is the role of linkages, backward and forward linkages that then got added on, what were called demand-induced linkages. We can talk some more about it. And finally, that strategies were more open processes, more open to what he would later call, and this came up, self-subversion. You could revise them much more easily than you could a plan. And his focus then at the core of the book really is then on the cognitive development process within the economic development process. And that the word strategy enabled us to think about that the plan was not designed to open up. The second twin words, and I know that Ignacio doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is the relationship between reform and revolution, not reform or revolution. You're going to protest already, I think. Because when Hirschman went back to Yale, because he had a revolutionary's esprit when it came to thinking about reform. When he moved back to the United States, by the time the McCarthy era had waned and went to Yale, the Rockefeller Foundation approached him. This was in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, a lot of anxiety in the United States about what's going on in Latin America, and that he knew something about development from the ground up, could speak Spanish, unlike many of the people who are now moving into this business. They had approached him about developing a relationship, bridges to Latin American social sciences. And it was out of that Hirschman would write A Journeys Toward Progress. Cómo imaginar el desequilibrio en la tradición, right? En la tradición revolucionaria sin caer en las certidumbres de los telos revolucionarios. So how to keep the spirit of revolution but separate it from the teleologies. And this was so, and I think this is why it's reform and revolution, or a tension between the two words that was at stake. And for those of you who are not familiar with this book, Journeys Toward Progress, there were 4 original case studies funded started as Rockefeller Foundation and then became the 20th Century Fund. And you can begin to see the incursion of American foundations in the development of social science on and in Latin America at the time. The case studies were, so remind me, inflation in Chile,
In Chile,
agrarian reform in Colombia. So this is INCORA, which was the institute created to oversee the agrarian reform process. Regional planning in Brazil, Sudene, in Celso Furtado, and the book was dedicated to Celso Furtado. And Lleras Restrepo, who was the man behind INCORA. They were reform mongers, which was an early term, one might say, of the possibilist. And a reform monger is someone who thrives on disruption. We would now call it disruption, I guess. And creating a disequilibrium in order to promote social change. In the course of doing the field work, he also teamed up with a really interesting American political scientist, Charles Lindblom. This is the two of them, actually in Colombia still, doing observation works. And looking at projects rather than planning. Lindblom was best known, some of you may know this, for his work on policy studying, for the importance of incrementalism, the role of daring, of muddling through as a strategy, right? And very importantly for Hirschman, what was so appealing was the limits of knowledge. That one didn't have to know everything and exhaust the field of knowledge as a precondition for doing anything. In other words, one could act in the world, apply ideas without being sure they were going to work out. This also goes into the self-subversion concept. Look at what you do, evaluate, self-critique, and adapt. Again, part of his questioning of the condition of certainty before action, right, which also lent itself to a deferential attitude to the foreign expert syndrome. So here is the reform monger, Celso Furtado, as the engaged social scientist and the heroic policymaker. So that's engagement number two. The third grew out of, this is a photograph, and you can see Sarah there also with Albert. This is a photograph taken in India because he was, after Journeys Toward Progress, he was hired by the Brookings Institution as a way of evaluating what the World Bank was doing in the Third World, and wrote a beautiful little book called Development Projects Observed. And it completed a trilogy about development that started with strategy, then journeys, and then ends with development, what he called DPO. We've gone from strategies to policies. So the first one was on strategies of development. The second book was about policies of development, particularly around reform. And the third one was around projects as devices, as levers you could use in the development process. And the heroic actors changed. The first heroes were the entrepreneurs, creating decision-making capacities. The second, in the second book, it was clearly policy makers, particularly the engagé policymaker like Furtado. And then the third, by the time we get to development projects observed, he's inching towards himself here. It's the economist becomes, in a sense, the hero of the story. This is a particular, you can see his fatigue with the field work already. Sarah always had a good time traveling around the world with him. But there's a doble juxtaposition here. Because we see this was 1967, we're just about to get to the Desnoyers moment of memories of underdevelopment, que es un momento de culminación en la gran aventura del desarrollo, que coincidió justamente con su propia crisis, por un lado. Segundo, que es un momento de fama personal y a la vez cuestionamiento y dudas alrededor de la empresa desarrollista. That is, that the field that he was so closely identified with, which was development, was itself now running into crisis while he was becoming a globally recognized intellectual. Y es en ese contexto que él inventa el nuevo actor protagonista que Ignacio quiere discutir, sobre la escena, que es el posibilista. And he usa la noción de posibilista en dos sentidos, in two ways. One is ser abierto a oportunidades. Right? I think Pablo described it as being atento, right? Aware of possibilities. And if you think in too pessimistic ways, you will not be able to see opportunities. It was very important to be visually open. But that was only one sense. That's the sense I think that most of us take from the idea of the possibilist. But if you go back and you read strategy, you will see that he has another idea of possibilism, which is the creator of opportunities. So it's not just passively looking for where opportunities might exist, but crear oportunidades by, and this is where policies, projects, and interventions can create puntos de presión, those pressure points that he talks about in strategy, and desequilibrati. Now I don't even know what language I'm speaking anymore, and it's a good. Je vais commencer à parler en français. Really, I have to fly to Paris tomorrow, so. There's by creating points of pressure on structures that look stronger than you think they are, you can open these very estructuras congeladas, right? You can create possibilities or opportunities that the possibilist must jump into. And I think understanding those two valences is very important. It was, of course, at this point that there enters now, just as the development decade, the disenchantment begins, and yet he's trying to project what he calls a bias for hope, very closely tied to the notion of an actor who would create and identify opportunities for societies to reform, comes another tension, which is of hope and despair. Many of you will be familiar with exit, voice, and loyalty. A bias for hope, I won't go into them because they are known to you, except to say that this idea of despair and hope, el bias, ¿cómo se tradujo? El sesgo, pero ¿cómo se tradujo cuando se tradujo el libro? When the book was...
Bias for hope.
No se ha traducido, creo.
La compilación de ensayos nunca se tradujo. Es cierto.
Es un viés.
En portugués.
No
está publicado.
Claro. So it's a bias, es un sesgo hacia la esperanza. Yeah. So but what's the bias exists for a reason, because it's a bias against a pressure.
Desviación, I think it's more.
No. Es viés. Es deliberada, es un viés deliberado.
Este es un laboratorio de por qué preferiría hablar en inglés. Simplemente por tener que usar la palabra indígena de él, que no es el lenguaje porque es alemán. Pero él está...
Por favor.
No, pero porque juega constantemente con la palabra. En varios idiomas a la vez, incluso en español y a veces en portugués. In any event, what's important about the metaphor, the idea of having a bias against hope, was sailing or navigating against the wind. This came up this morning. I'm going to show you a slide in a minute. This is very important because in 1973, and then Fernando Henrique, who's already part of the story here, I've not smuggled him in yet, but in 1973, when Albert Hirschman is the chair of the Joint Committee for Latin American Studies at the Social Science Research Council, yes, there will be a brainstorming session, to make the story very short, where Fernando Henrique, Guillermo O'Donnell, a few others, Albert convokes a group. What was unique about that group within the Social Science Research Council method was that Latin Americans were very present in the design and conceptualization of the projects. Was the development of a very important project around authoritarianism and democracy in Latin America. We can talk a little bit more about that if you want, but what's important in 1973 is he's trying to find strategies. Have you seen this photograph? Yeah. You have this one? Okay. Yes. So the two of them are getting, this is 1978, I think, honorary degrees at Rutgers. Albert really liked this photograph, not just because he's beside his friend, but because it was proof finally that he got a real degree. Yeah, that's right. Because he had all these bogus European degrees that no American had ever heard of. So, but between the Institute for Advanced Study, where you all spent time, the Social Science Research Council was the development of this network of Latin American intellectuals to create, as one might think, as sort of a space in which to practice the bias for hope. It's also worth recalling that that project that they were collaborating on was itself an attack on the exhaustion thesis. That is, the idea that the model of development was finished and that it was then, this is what had set the stage for the authoritarian turn. He was at the time in the early process of thinking about going back and rethinking development. If I had a chalkboard here, I could continue the drawing, which you can see in his archives. This is a photograph taken at Cieplan in, I think, 1980 or 81. And what he's describing there is the sailing against the wind. It's the adversarial model, that balanced growth, the sort of idealized balanced growth was a single straight line balancing between agriculture and industry. The zigzagging was the Latin American pattern, and then of course he adds a third one, which is the Argentine pattern, where the lines go wild back and forth. So. But what was important to it was a search for a different way of thinking about determination. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier this morning about how historic conditions and even global historic conditions can determine what you can and cannot do. And he felt that what was needed, and this was part of the esprit of the group, was a better explanation of how we got dictatorships, how we got authoritarian rule in order to find alternatives to get out of them. So the search for understanding the origins was very important. And this, of course, led him back to the Weimar Republic and to his rethinking of, one might say, even the very models of modernism. Okay, I'm going to wind up with the very final encounter that comes out of an experiment that he does in 1982-83. It leads to a little, very forgotten book called Getting Ahead Collectively. And you have to remember in 1982, this was Ronald Reagan. It was the debt crisis in Latin. We talked about it earlier. I mean, Pablo described it as this, the curtain fell on a cycle. It was very hard to imagine any source of hope in that landscape. So what he set out to do was to find ways of imagining hope amid hopelessness. And he did so in this project as an evaluation of funding given by the Inter-American Foundation to grassroots development. That development came from below. And so you can even see, this to go back to his Colombian roots, that there's something happening on the ground that the master planners miss. So one is that the change comes from below. Second, that it does so by coming together. And he was trying to resist, again in 1982, a strong impulse with the rise of a particular style, especially in the United States in the social sciences, identified with the work of a guy called Mancur Olson, which argued about the impossibility and the futility of collective action. And to create a narrative style, short stories, a different set of heroes. Now the heroes were teachers, nurses, bicycle repairmen. And it was a book absolutely concept-free. Unlike everything else he had written, which was always dripping with concepts, sometimes too many concepts, this had none. Very, very simple prose. I think, actually, we were talking about Sarah's influence, I think, was very strong on this one. Even in the genre of the writing, these would be short stories that people could read and understand, to have a narrative about what they were doing in history. This is my last image. Okay, so that's in Dominican Republic. Oop. It got unplugged. Well, that's interesting. You might want to get this image because for important reasons, as you'll see in a minute.
I need help here.
It's the inauguration for President Cardoso. And the photograph exemplifies this new fusion of... Es la última. Eso. Or just click through. There you go. Almost there. There you go. Good. Ótimo. Alejandro no está. Yeah, it was Alejandro who gave me the photograph, actually. So I thought if he were here, it would be a nice juxtaposition. Anyway, what it represented, in some ways, was the completion for him of a new fusion now of the engaged intellectual, right? And the role of knowledge for social change. So I'll just conclude with observations about three facets of Hirschman's thinking about development. One was the importance of observation and engagement. As he said, holding up an empirical lantern in a dark world through case studies in the field. But that this did not mean that the social sciences had to be neutral. Secondly, was to capture complex processes and lives, often with simple explanations or concepts, and especially aphorisms, and Montaigne is very important for how he delivers the content. But he was so unhappy with Homo economicus, and that was at the core of the discipline that he most identified with, which was with economics. He wanted passions and interests. Everybody thought it was passions versus interests. No, it's passions and the interests. But he did have a conceptual ambition, which was to create an endogenous theory, that development was not a deus ex machina. And the key to understanding this was the creation of what Amartya Sen, and they have a family relationship to each other, would call human capacity. And then the last one is that he was a skeptical optimist, or a pragmatic idealist. And in a sense, there's a question that he had, a lifelong question he had about Hegel. And this was his trouble with being both on the left and at the right, on the right. It shifted with time. Sometimes he found himself speaking as a market-friendly critic to his friends on the left, and when everybody was herding towards the market, he would ask for a little bit more socialist conversation. It makes him very hard, though, to categorize, but it also is what makes him so singular. There is I don't know if you have this in Brazil, but if you drive along highways in the United States and you pull over into gas stations to refuel your vehicle, you will often find little book stands there. What would Jesus say? I don't know whether Ignacio wanted me to say, what would Albert Hirschman say? It's often, it's a problem. Jews and the people on the left have a difficulty. Who would you choose? Is it Lenin? Is it Gramsci? Is it, or for Jews, of course, where would you start? Moses, Abraham. The Christians have an advantage, right? They can just, what would Jesus say? So what would Albert Hirschman say? I was thinking this today about the conversations we've been having. One is he would be very resistant to a pessimistic, over-investing in pessimistic conclusions about our present. Not to say that we should be mindlessly optimistic, but we don't know. Be possibilist. Another, avoid over-investment in macro-structural determinations. And I think this came up actually in your opening comments, which was to the importance in your book of thinking of non-mechanical ways of explaining the relationship between global integration, social formations, and political conditions. This is why the word strategy was so important. We might want to kind of recover that as a key word. And then finally, think in countervailing ways. Think about what kinds of, or be atento, in Pablo's language, to the countervailing pressures against what looked like overwhelming, driving structural propensities to move one way in history. Y con eso termino. Muito obrigado.